The date on the telegram was September 14, 1911. It was sent from the Regional Field Office of the United States Geological Survey in Carson City, Nevada, addressed to the Division of Mineral Resources in Washington, D.C. The message was 4 sentences long. The first 3 were standard procedural language: survey completion, data submission, transfer of field notes to the archive ledger. The 4th sentence was unusual. It read, "Findings in sectors 7 through 11 require immediate review before any portion of this report is permitted to enter public record." That report was Federal Survey Catalog number 1911-NV-GS-44, filed under Record Group 57 of the United States Geological Survey Archive. It covered a 340-square-mile section of the central Nevada basin, running from the eastern edge of Nye County through the upper reaches of the Reese River corridor. The survey had been commissioned in early 2010 as part of a broader federal land assessment, part of the ongoing effort to identify extractable mineral deposits across the federally held interior West. The lead geologist assigned to the survey was a man named Elias Morrow. He was 41 years old, had spent 17 years working for the USGS, and published 7 geological assessments, all of which passed review without incident. His professional record was described in a 1909 performance evaluation still held in the personnel files of the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, as meticulous, conservative, and of unimpeachable scientific integrity. Elias Morrow completed Survey 1911-NV-GS-44 in August of that year. He filed his field notes, transferred his core samples to the Denver Assay Repository, and submitted the completed report to Washington as required. 3 weeks later, he sent the telegram requesting restricted review of sectors 7 through 11. The report was placed into restricted access status on October 2, 1911. It was never published. It was never cited in any subsequent federal land assessment, and for the next 62 years it did not appear in any accessible geological index. What Elias Morrow found beneath those sectors and what it implied about the geology of central Nevada is not what the official record of that region has ever acknowledged. To understand why the findings mattered, you have to understand what was already known about Nevada's subsurface geology in 1911, and more importantly, what was being actively hidden from it. The Comstock lode, the great silver deposit discovered in 1859 in what is now Story County, had defined the federal government's understanding of Nevada's mineral wealth for half a century. By 1910, the Comstock mines were in decline. Production had peaked in the 1870s and had fallen steadily since. The dominant geological consensus, shared by the USGS and repeated in every public land survey issued between 1910 and 1915, was that Nevada's deep mineral deposits were largely exhausted or confined to a narrow band of the central mountain ranges. That consensus shaped federal land policy. It shaped the terms under which Nevada's interior land was leased to mining companies. It shaped which parcels were open to homestead claim and which were held in Federal Reserve. And it was, according to the field notes Morrow submitted alongside Survey 1911 NV-GS-44, almost certainly wrong. What Morrow's survey identified in sectors 7 through 11 was a sub-basin formation he described in his field notes as a compressed thermal cavity complex, a deep geological structure whose characteristics, based on core sample analysis and ground resistivity measurements taken at 11 separate test points, indicated the presence of mineral deposits at depths far beyond the standard extraction range of the era. He estimated the compressed formation ran laterally for approximately 60 miles and reached depths between 1,400 and 2,200 feet below surface. More significant than the depth was the composition. The core samples from those 11 test points contained elevated concentrations of what Morrow's analysis identified as chalcopyrite and molybdenite, indicators not of exhausted silver geology, but of a completely different and far more valuable mineral system, one that was not supposed to be there.
The 1911 Federal Mineral Classification Tables, codified under Bureau of Mines Circular No. 44B, did not include molybdenum as a tracked strategic mineral. But by September of 1911, the same month Morrow sent his telegram, the War Department had quietly begun internal correspondence about strategic material needs for military-grade steel alloys. Molybdenum was central to those discussions. The records of that correspondence were not declassified until 1974. Morrow almost certainly did not know that, but someone in Washington reviewing his report almost certainly did.
The restricted access notation on Survey 1911 NV-GS44 on October 2, 1911, was signed by a deputy administrator in the USGS Division of Mineral Resources named Herbert Colton. Under standard USGS archival procedure at the time, a restricted access notation required either a written explanation filed with the report or a cross-referenced memo submitted to the divisional archive within 30 days of the restriction order. No such explanation was filed. No cross-referenced memo exists in the archive. The restriction was logged, the report was shelved, and the administrative trail stops there. This is where most researchers who have encountered the 1911 Nevada survey tend to assume clerical error. The early USGS archival system was, by any reasonable assessment, imperfect. Records were misfiled, memos were lost, procedures were inconsistently applied. It would be entirely reasonable to conclude that Survey 1911 NV-GS44 was simply buried by bureaucratic entropy rather than deliberate suppression. That explanation holds until you look at what happened to the land. The 340-square-mile area covered by Morrow's Sectors 7 through 11 was reclassified under a federal land reservation order on March 9, 1912, 5 months after the survey was restricted. The reservation order, Federal Land Reserve Directive 1912 NV-041, designated the area as unsuitable for mineral extraction, timber use, or homestead claim due to geological instability. It was signed by the same deputy administrator, Herbert Colton. The land remained under federal reservation designation for the next 32 years. In 1944, a subsidiary of Anaconda Copper Mining Company filed a mineral rights application for a 60-mile corridor running through the eastern portion of Nye County, directly overlapping Morrow's Sectors 8 through 11. The application cited no prior survey data. The federal reservation designation had been quietly lifted in March of 1943, 1 year earlier, with no explanation in the public land registry. The Anaconda subsidiary began exploratory drilling in that corridor in early 1945. By 1948, the operation had been quietly absorbed into the company's primary production infrastructure. The specific output of those drill sites was not reported in the public mining records filed with the Nevada State Bureau of Mines between 1945 and 1958.
Elias Morrow died in 1936 in Reno, Nevada. He gave one recorded interview in his retirement years, published in the March 1931 edition of the Western Mining Quarterly, a trade journal. In that interview, when asked about his most significant fieldwork, he described a survey he had conducted in the Central Basin country that had produced results he believed were of considerable importance to the federal record. He said nothing more specific. The interview moved on. No follow-up was ever published.
The core samples Morrow transferred to the Denver Assay Repository in August of 1911 should still be there. Federal Geological Sample Retention Policy, as codified in Repository Administrative Circular No. 7, issued in 1905, required physical samples from federally commissioned surveys to be held in secured storage for a minimum of 50 years from the date of submission. The samples from Survey 1911 NVGS 44 are not in the Denver repository. There is no transfer record indicating they were moved to another facility. There is no destruction order in the archive. There is no record at all of what happened to them after September of 1911. They are simply absent from every catalog index that should reference them. This is not unique, and that is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what happened to the 1911 Nevada report. Between 1908 and 1917, the USGS completed 43 federally commissioned geological surveys of the interior western states. Of those 43 surveys, 11 were placed into restricted access status before publication. Of those 11, 7 were accompanied by the standard explanatory documentation required by procedure. 4 were not. All 4 of the surveys missing their required documentation covered areas that were subsequently reclassified under federal land reservation orders within 18 months of the restriction. And in every case, the reservation designation was lifted within a decade of the first private mineral rights applications for the same land. Every single one, the same pattern, 4 separate times in 4 separate states across 9 years. The 4 surveys were Nevada 1911, Wyoming 1909, Idaho 1913, and Montana 1916. The 4 land reservation areas subsequently opened to private mineral claims were all found to contain commercially viable deposits of minerals that had been identified, quietly, internally, as strategically significant by federal military and industrial planners in the years immediately preceding each survey's restriction. This was not a broken filing system. This was a filing system working exactly as intended, just not for the public record it was supposed to serve. The question that surfaces every time someone pulls the thread on Survey 1911-NV-GS44 is the same question. Why restrict it rather than simply delay publication? The USGS had legitimate procedural mechanisms for delaying the release of survey data. National security provisions, ongoing review periods, disputed methodology flags. Any of those would have produced a documented paper trail. A restriction without documentation was harder to explain, but it was also harder to trace. And there is a secondary question that gets less attention but is more disturbing. Who was reading the surveys before Morrow finished them? Morrow's field notes, which were submitted alongside the report and which are partially accessible in Record Group 57, contain a notation dated July 22, 1911, nearly 2 months before the survey was completed and submitted. The notation, written in Morrow's own hand, reads, "Second inquiry received from Washington regarding anticipated findings in Sector 9. Replied that core analysis is incomplete. Inquiry originated from offices unknown to Standard Division correspondence." Someone in Washington was asking about Sector 9 before Morrow had finished analyzing it, before the report was complete, before any findings were officially filed. That means whoever sent those inquiries already had access to partial data, either through unofficial correspondence with Morrow's field team or through some mechanism of information access that bypassed the standard reporting chain entirely. Morrow noted the inquiry. He replied that the analysis was incomplete. He submitted his report 6 weeks later. 3 weeks after that, the restriction order was placed. The offices from which those inquiries originated have never been identified. There is no correspondence in the USGS Divisional Archive matching the time frame and subject matter. If the inquiries were sent through official channels, the paper trail was removed. If they were sent through unofficial channels, they were never part of the official record to begin with.
There is one more document that connects directly to Survey 1911 NV-GS-44, and it does not live in the Geological Archive. In 1972, a researcher named Patricia Aldine, working on a doctoral dissertation at the University of Nevada, Reno on the history of federal land policy in the Great Basin, filed a Freedom of Information request for all USGS survey records pertaining to Nye County between 1905 and 1920. She received a response acknowledging 17 surveys on file. She then filed a second request for the full records of all 17. 14 surveys were released to her in full. 2 were released in partially redacted form. 1, identified only by its catalog number, 1911 NV-GS-44, was withheld in its entirety under a classification exemption that in 1972 still required only a one-line administrative justification. The justification given was contents subject to ongoing review. 61 years after the report was filed, still under ongoing review. Aldine noted the withholding in her dissertation filed in 1974 and described Survey 1911 NV-GS-44 as the single most anomalous record in the Nye County USGS archive, a survey whose continued restriction more than 6 decades after its submission suggests either extraordinary bureaucratic inertia or the continued relevance of whatever findings prompted its original classification. Her dissertation was published in a limited academic edition of 300 copies. It has never been digitized. It is held in the Special Collections Archive of the Geological Library at the University of Nevada, Reno, under call number F841.A42. A further FOIA request filed in 1988 by a Nevada journalist named Carl Renner received the same response, contents subject to ongoing review. Renner published a short piece in the Nevada State Journal in October of that year, noting the continued withholding. The piece generated no significant follow-up. Renner left journalism in 1991. The current status of Survey 1911 NV-GS-44 in the Federal Archive System is listed as of the most recent accessible USGS Catalog Index as Pending Declassification Review. It has held that status since at least 1972, possibly longer. The first documented access request is Aldine's, but there is no record indicating that 1972 was the first time someone tried.
What Elias Morrow found beneath those 11 test points in the central Nevada basin in the summer of 1911 was not, on its own, world-ending information. It was geological data, core samples, resistivity readings, the kind of technical, specific, professionally unremarkable documentation that thousands of field surveyors across the American West in that era. What made it dangerous was its timing, what made it suppressible was its specificity, and what made it worth suppressing was the gap between what it showed and what the official geological record of Nevada was permitted to show. Because the official geological consensus about central Nevada, the one that shaped land policy, defined extraction rights, and determined which parcels were opened and which were held, was not a conclusion reached by the available evidence. It was a conclusion selected from the available evidence. The surveys that confirmed it were published. The surveys that contradicted it were not. This is how institutional science serves institutional power without ever technically lying. You do not falsify the record, you manage the record. You restrict the inconvenient data, reclassify the relevant land, and allow private interests to quietly acquire what the public record officially deemed worthless. By the time the extraction begins, the survey that would have explained it is buried deep enough that no one thinks to look for it, and the geologist who wrote it has been retired for a decade, giving vague answers to trade journal interviewers who don't know the right questions to ask. The land in what was Morrow's Sectors 7 through 11 is currently held under a combination of private mineral rights leases and federal designation. The specific mineral production records for that corridor remain non-public under proprietary extraction claim protections filed with the Nevada Division of Minerals. Whatever is beneath that ground, it has been producing quietly for the better part of a century. The report that first described it has been on ongoing review for over 100 years. There are 42 other withdrawn federal geological surveys on record from the same era. Not all of them even have an Elias Morrow. Not all of them left a telegram behind.
Most of them left nothing. And somewhere beneath the ground those surveys were supposed to document, the extraction continues, in the dark, exactly as planned. The question that stays with you isn't what Morrow found in Sector 9. The question is, how many Sector 9s are still sitting in restricted status right now? Surveys filed in good faith by people who had no idea what they were actually documenting, filed away before a single word of it could reach the public record, waiting for a review that was never meant to arrive. The archive is still there. The catalog numbers still exist. Someone just has to know which ones to ask for.